Hello, everyone. This is Keith Stone with the Center for Hellenic Studies and members of the Cosmos Society. And we're here today for an online open house with Dr. Norman Sandridge of Howard University and the Center for Hellenic Studies. And thank you for joining us, Norman. It's great to have you here.
Oh, it is absolutely my pleasure to be here, Keith. Thank you.
Let me just read a little introduction of Norman to everyone who's assembled here. Norman Sandridge is Associate Professor of Classics at Howard University and Fellow in Leadership Studies and in Greater Washington Outreach at the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies. Dr. Sandridge began his academic career with an interest in physics and philosophy, with a goal at the beginning of college to become an astronaut and a cosmologist. Yet, after an inspiring series of courses in Latin, and I think this is something we all hope happens to many people, he became more interested in the humanities and, in fact, pursued graduate degrees in Greek, Latin, and classics, with a focus on ethics, the emotions, heroism, and leadership. He wrote a master's thesis on the theme of redemption in Tragedies of Sophocles, and a dissertation on the Argonautica of Apollonius of Rhodes. In 2010 and 11, he was a research fellow at the Center for Hellenic Studies and remains an ongoing fellow in leadership study there. And one last item of note, particular note, his 2012 book, Loving Humanity, Learning, and Being Honored, The Foundations of Leadership in Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, was an exploration of Xenophon's theory of leadership and the extent to which three character traits, philanthropia, philomathia, and philotimia, could be seen as the basis for all other important leadership traits. And I know that Norman has those written on the board behind him, so I hope that we'll get to talk about those today. So thanks again for joining us, Norman. And I wonder if you could maybe begin by talking about how today's topic on the death of leaders or great people is related to your ongoing research.
Well, again, thank you for that kind introduction, Keith, and welcome everyone. It's great to see everyone there. I count nine people on this Hangout, so we are really testing the limits, which is awesome. It's great to be here with you all, as I say, and I'm excited to have a conversation about what we could call, I guess, death and leadership, or questions of what is a good death for a leader, what is a bad death for a leader, what does the type of death that you receive say about you as a leader? Does it say anything, or is it totally meaningless? So the passage that I wanted to focus on, I think everybody saw it. It's from Suetonius's Life of Julius Caesar, particularly in chapter 87. And maybe I'll just read it to get us all on the same page here. Suetonius says, "About one thing, almost all are fully agreed." He's talking about agreement in the way he died. He said that he all but desired such death as he met, stabbed brutally some 23 times by Roman senators, as Suetonius says. So it's a very striking thing to say that this was the kind of death that Caesar was hoping for. But Suetonius goes on to explain, "For once when he read in Xenophon how Cyrus in his last illness gave directions for his funeral, he expressed his horror of such a lingering kind of end, and his wish for one which was swift and sudden. And the day before his murder, in a conversation which arose at dinner at the house of Marcus, as to what manner of death was most to be desired, he had given his preference to one which was sudden and unexpected." So I think that's a pretty amazing thing. I think most of the time we imagine that Caesar's death was a pretty tragic way to die. He was only 56 years old. He had just been voted dictator for life a month earlier. He could have established himself as emperor of Rome in the way that his heir Augustus later would. So it's remarkable that he would want this kind of death. And before, well, so I'm as a question of leadership, I want to know what does it say about Caesar that he wanted to die this way? And I want particularly to think about this in the context of his reading of Xenophon's education of Cyrus, which we know from Cicero. And a lot of people were reading it. Apparently, a lot of young men were reading it as a handbook to good leadership. And it's a work that seemed to have particular resonance with a Roman audience at this time, in distinction with Plato's Republic. Many of you, if you've studied ideals of ancient leadership at all, know that Plato's Republic, the go conceptions of ideal Plato's philosopher king or philosopher queen. The popularity of Xenophon's education of Cyrus in Caesar's own day, that it was, a lot of people read it and seemingly were reacting to it. But anyway, I mean, we could begin, or do you want to ask a follow-up question, Keith? That's kind of where I'm coming at it from. Just why would Caesar have wanted this kind of death, supposedly one that is the Latin means something like both a death that is sudden and one that is either unforeseen, sort of inopinatum. It means like one you never could have guessed, like almost like a strange death, like one that you were not. I think the idea is you weren't. It's so strange that you didn't have the capacity to dread it. In other words, it was just, it was completely unpredictable, and that's like a good way to go out.
So a kind of a bizarre scenario, or not just unpredictable but unusual.
Yeah, exactly. Unusual to the mind, like you one that opinor in Latin means to opine, to surmise, and so this was just the kind of death you would not see coming, and he seemed to think that's a good kind of death, and I'm curious what others think about that kind of death, or what you think it might reveal about Caesar as a leader.
Hi, Norman. Thanks
Hi.
for coming. I have a question. Is he looking for a meaningful death? Yes, it's unusual, but there were rumors that this might happen, and he didn't protect himself. So, by this kind of death, is this part of his legacy?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely part of his legacy, and I mean, it goes down in history as one of the most tragic kinds of deaths there are. I think, to be betrayed, it's very tragic in a very classical sense, in that you are betrayed by your nearest and dearest, and it kind of fulfills one of the features, well, actually two of the features of Aristotelian tragedy, in the sense that it's a sudden reversal, right? Caesar had been elevated to the most powerful person on the planet, and seemingly, the most invulnerable because of his power. And so there's a great reversal when he dies. But there's also what Aristotle calls the anagnorisis, or the recognition that people you thought were friends turn out to be enemies. And, of course, Brutus is, the special case here, someone that Caesar had pardoned after the battle of Pharsalus and shown great mercy to, now betraying him. So it's very tragic, and yet it's the one that he wanted. So others have a view about, is this the kind of way you would want to go out?
I'm too young to have thought about that yet.
Yeah. Well, he was only 56. I know you're not 56 yet, Keith, but Roman senators were like in their 30s. So,
Right.
Well, if I may, hi, I'm Jack Vaughn in Houston. Well, when I was 60, one morning, after walking my dogs and thinking it was just an ordinary day before going to the office, I had a major heart attack and flatlined in the hospital. And one of the things that I thought in that experience was, this is really not a bad way to go. I have not, there's an orthodontist told me, well, the worst thing about a procedure is the expectation of the procedure. and you know, my goodness, you know, I was living a full life 2 hours ago, and now I'm hearing the heart monitor at flat line. So that was a very interesting encounter with the other side. But you know, for someone who is a leader, and you know, has faced a lot of danger, as Julius Caesar did, it seems to me that's also a natural thing for wanting his legacy to just be there, you know, with momentum, rather than say, you know, to have some long drawn out consumptive illness, which gives all the people with the long knives time to jockey for position and intrigue and water down everything in advance of him leaving. So Alexander said that he wanted his empire to go to the best, and I think when a leader drives like that, you know, the best is going to get it without all the intrigue and conspiracy such as killed Julius Caesar.
Thank you for that, Jack, and I hope all is well now. You haven't had any subsequent heart attacks, and you've been on hale and hearty ever since.
Yeah, I've survived 2 more, but I'm hale and hearty.
Oh wow, wow, yeah. Well,
but I don't think I would have if I hadn't gone back to my teenage ways of athletics.
Oh, that's so interesting that you say that, because I do a lot of distance running, and one of the things that you often hear about distance runners is that they want to revive their glory days, you know, running in high school, and they end up having heart attacks on the race course because they go out too fast and they haven't conditioned themselves properly, or they can't bring back that prior glory.
Right. Well, you have to acclimate, and that's, I don't want to change the subject, but you know, it really was a miracle that I survived. And one of the cardiologists attending said, "You must have done a lot of good things when you were young to go through cardiac arrest that long and still, you know, have your mind."
Wow.
So,
yeah.
So I think you build up a secondary system, and those other secondary arteries were, you know, keeping my brain going.
Interesting.
Question from is it from Maria in the chat? Is that a question you wanted me to ask?
Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you ask the question? Because I was just wondering about, you know, he knew what was coming, because I think that Alcibiades, you know, another leader, eloquent and charismatic too, you know, and in the dialogue from Plato, at the end, Socrates, he ends the dialogue by saying, you know, I quoted the passage from Perseus, but, you know, in my own words, you know, saying that they knew what was coming for them. They knew that it was coming from the States. And both Socrates and Alcibiades, they died. So I'm just wondering, you know.
Yeah. So Socrates is obviously another point of reference we could think of in terms of having a good death. And I mean, well, the other thing I was going to bring up is the idea that while Caesar's death is tragic, you could also look at it as heroic, if in no other way than you get it's a great story, right? It's very memorable the way it happens, in the same way that death is very memorable the way it happens, and they're both, you might say, they both go out on their own terms. They both get what they want in the end, even if what one of them wants is to be surprised by the way that they die.
We've talked a lot in terms of heroes about how heroes script their own deaths.
Yes.
And I mean, the irony in this case is Caesar, in his script, calls for something that he hasn't written himself.
Yeah, an improvised death. Yeah. Yeah, well, maybe this would be a good place to talk about Cyrus for a moment. And this is partly what's so interesting to me about this case, is that Suetonius makes a point to say that Caesar was reacting to the kind of death that Cyrus gets in Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, which is an amazing death scene. And I shared the clip or the Perseus link there in case you want to read it. It's the second to last chapter in the Education of Cyrus, which takes you all the way from Cyrus's birth to his death. And if you know anything about the death of Cyrus in Herodotus, you know that it is a very tragic death. It's probably not one you would want. It's where Cyrus goes up against a people called the Massagetae in the farthest reaches of the eastern end of the Persian Empire. And it's a death that involves transgression, kind of like Patroclus in the Iliad. Cyrus goes too far. He overstretches. He loses at the hands of a woman. This woman who's the queen of the Massagetae, named Tomyris. He dies in battle, and he's beheaded, and his head is soaked in blood as a symbol of just how hungry he had been for warfare. So that Cyrus had different versions of the way he died, and that's how he dies in Herodotus. But in Xenophon, it's exactly the opposite. I mean, in some ways, it's exactly the opposite in a very self-conscious way. What I mean by that is Cyrus lives to a long old age. He has a dream that his death is upon him. He has the opportunity to summon his friends and family. He can pass on the reign to his oldest son, Cambyses. He can even caution his sons about warring with one another, even though it's not going to work out. But he has a very telling line where he describes his fate. He says, this is in subchapter 7 there, in chapter 7 of book 8. He says, "Throughout the past, I have fared even as I have wished. But a fear was ever at my side, lest in the time to come I might see or hear or experience something unpleasant. This would not let me become overweeningly proud or extravagantly happy." In other words, Xenophon Cyrus is just a cautious guy throughout his whole life. And all of his conquests, all of his prosperity, he always sensed, something bad could happen to him, and he was wary. And as a result, he lived a long life, and he's happy in a very Herodotean way. And it just it turns the earlier death of Cyrus on its ear. It's like this Cyrus, Xenophon Cyrus, has learned the mistakes of the past Cyrus and isn't going to die that way. So it seems like a really pleasant way to go. If we could script our death, that would be a way to go. And yet Caesar not only says, I want a swift and surprise death, he says, I want the opposite of what Cyrus had.
It reminds me of Agamemnon. His death is a surprise.
Yes. Yeah, and not typically regarded as one. It has a lot of the same features as Caesar's death, but that's not really one you would really want, I don't think.
Right. After death, he complains about it. It's not how it would have wanted to end.
Yeah.
Maria.
Maria, yeah.
Oh, unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. Norman, all things that you said so far made me think about a very specific literary genre that comes right after Xenophon. For example, if someone reads Plutarch's lives, Plutarch's biographies, you would say that it's in a way a post-eventum assessment of people who really excelled in their lifetime, and probably they had, in a way, a commensurate death. So if we think that on the one hand we have a life, and on the other hand we have a death, in order someone to achieve a happy death, this entails that the death should be commensurate with the life he lived so far. So in case we have a discrepancy, in case there is a discrepancy between these two parameters, we would in a way tag or characterize this death either as heroic or an uneventful or an unhappy event. Do you think that this kind of correlation or algorithmic relation in a way applies to Xenophon's case?
Wow, that's let me see if I understand correctly what you're saying. When you say that a death is commensurate with a life, you don't,
for example,
you don't mean like in a way that it offsets it. Like if you had a good life, you get a bad death, or if you had a bad life, you get a good death. Or is that what you mean?
This is the most simple way to interpret it. On the other hand, this is the most simple way. Another way to interpret this relation is, for example, you just said that Caesar's death is considered a heroic death and probably an expected death, or the right way to die for a person like Caesar.
Mm-hmm.
So can you regard this eventful death or eventful way of death commensurate to an equally eventful life like Caesar? As I told you, there are many kinds of relation. If we think that life and death should be either in discrepancy or in absolute correlation to one another.
Yeah.
What triggered my question, because I thought, for example, Plutarch's Lives, which in a way it's an assessment of a life already lived. Okay,
right.
It's like by the way, it's like reading the obituaries in New York Times.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to use Plutarch, I think one way or one example I can think of to tackle your question would be, say, the death of Mark Antony in Plutarch. So, you know, like there's so many different ways to die in the ancient world, and we could talk more about what are the ways to die slowly. But I think probably a slow death in general is regarded as a failure in some way, or as a mark on a lack of resolve or a lack of determination. And so Mark Antony, for example, in the life of Antony, has a pretty amazing death. Once he knows he believes, first of all, erroneously, that Cleopatra is already dead. And so he's kind of pining for her. He's kind of in despair, and he has a slave named Eros. Not surprisingly, Antony would have a slave named Eros, and that would be very paradoxical. And he asks first he asks Eros if Eros will kill him, and Eros says okay, and he starts to do it, and then Eros can't go through with it. Eros can't kill Antony, so Eros kills himself, and so now the slave becomes an example for Antony to supposedly kill himself, but he tries it, and he can't get the sword in the right place, so he ends up just like mortally wounding himself. But it's not instant. It does become one of these lingering, overly sentimental. He stabs himself. He doesn't die. And then he learns, before he dies, he learns that Cleopatra is still alive. And so he gets carried to her chamber, like lifted up to it, and dies in her arms. And it's bittersweet, but it's also very pathetic, I think. It speaks to, you might say, the fact that Antony had such poor resolution. Like, the ancient world hates people. Generally, it hates people that don't have strong resolution, that are not courageous in that sense of being able to carry through with their act. So, Maria, I don't know, is this an example of what you're talking about? I think there it's very clearly, Antony died as he lived,
yes.
Indecisively, ambivalent toward love, very sentimental kind of thing.
Yes, you also gave, you already gave an answer to what you just said about Caesar. For example, for a person like Caesar, in a way, we expect for someone's, for an illustrious person, for a person who is, well, up to a point, a conqueror, to die a death like this. So yes, yes. Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Other questions?
Yes.
I've got one.
Go ahead, Anne.
I'm Anne from Northeast England. Maybe connected what Maria was saying, I wonder if you see any ritualized aspect to some of these deaths. Because, I mean, you mentioned a couple of beheadings, and I can think of others. I was, in looking for ancient deaths today, I was reading about Judith and Holofernes, and John the Baptist, and various others. I was also thinking about this aspect of clothing. You mentioned Agamemnon. He wore a robe, didn't he? He was dressed in a robe as he got out of the bath. And I realized Caesar had adjusted his clothing, and I wondered,
for modesty.
What's that for modesty? And some of us have been reading the Aeneid, and Dido seemed to dispense robes before she died. She gave purple robes to Aeneas before he travelled, and she took them for herself. So there are two or three things there that I thought might have ritualized aspects.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And if I were a better scholar of ritual, I could probably do a better job of answering your question than I'm about to. But maybe other people have perspective as well. I mean, certainly Agamemnon's death is a ritualized sacrifice. Getting hacked with an axe, and the blood of Agamemnon spraying on Clytemnestra. A lot of sacrificial rituals involve beheadings and casting the head aside or putting the head on a pike. One of the more interesting rituals on the Persian side is there seems to have, going back to the death of Cyrus in Xenophon, where he's like laying out on a bed and has an opportunity to kind of recount all of his achievements and formally pass the reign on to his sons, like a deathbed kind of ritual where you say some words of wisdom and you pretty much anoint your successor at that moment. That seems to have been a regular Persian ritual. It's alluded to in some inscriptions of Darius. Is something like called the King's Last Speech or something like that seems to have been a ritual. And it's interesting for us that Xenophon seems to have preserved it. In other words, Xenophon didn't just riff on the death of Socrates or something. He actually knew how Persians tended to conduct their deaths. And Cyrus's own son, Cambyses, would do a similar thing in Herodotus, where people gather around you, and you usually share words of wisdom, and people say their goodbyes and things like that. But on I've dodged your question about the robes. I'm sure there's something significant there, but I'm not enough of a robe ritual expert to say more. Maybe Maria knows something about this, or others.
Right. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
So I actually have a follow-up question related to that. It's nothing to do with robes, you were pleased to hear. It's to do with there are all these omens and portents and signs, and I wondered if that's related either to ritual or to that almost sort of formalization, heroization type of setup. Is this apocryphal, or were there, we don't know, but is that sort of part of the package, as it were, to that scripting a death, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to bear in mind that pretty much everyone in the ancient world believed that the future was knowable if you had the right, if you knew how to interpret the clues properly. And it was even more knowable once it happened. Once it was, then you could be like, well, we really should have seen this coming, because X, Y, and Z happened before that. But in Caesar's case, sure. And I am intrigued by this idea that Caesar kind of knew it was coming too. Either he knew the signs or he knew the temperament of his colleagues, and was just going to take fewer precautions to guard himself, which kind of goes against getting the kind of death that he wanted. Like if you know it's coming, then it's no longer an unexpected death. Well, one other thing I was going to say about Caesar in terms of his own character, or his character as a leader, we have to remember he had epilepsy. So this was someone who was probably used to near-death experiences or sudden experiences like that, and maybe didn't fear them as much. Going back to Jack's point earlier, that the worst part is when the anticipation is there, and if you're used to surprises in your life, maybe Caesar was a psychopath or psychopathic a little bit as well, and so he was more immune to surprises than the rest of us. Other questions? I have one other big explanation for what's going on with Caesar, but I'm going to save it.
There's a question that I have here from someone watching.
Oh, nice.
The question is, could you comment on the ironically difficult death of Seneca the Younger?
I think the commenter is asking about how Seneca died. This is in Tacitus, when Seneca has been ordered to commit suicide by Nero, and Seneca seems to have tried to recreate for himself the kind of death that Socrates had. But Tacitus, either he didn't get exactly that, or Tacitus wasn't going to let him have that. So it takes him a lot longer. As I recall, he tries to slit his veins, and he goes into the bathtub, and he's not bleeding as profusely as he needs to be. And so what he had hoped would be kind of this dramatic moment, like they're all sitting there watching him philosophize on death, and then it's like he's like looking at his watch, and like he's just not dying on command. It's an absolutely baroque and kind of absurd scene in a way for poor Seneca. Although like later on, it's sometimes treated more nobly than that. But Tacitus isn't going to give him quite that. If I'm remembering the story well, like, I remember it being distinct.
End up being a failure.
Yeah, again, this idea of a lingering death, and to me, one of the exciting things or striking things about all this is just how hard it is to script our own deaths. I don't know if anybody's thought about how to do, other than like commit your own suicide, how you want, like, it's going to be very hard for you to choose, or, are you going to die of cancer, or which kind of cancer, how are you going to handle it? It's a really hard, unpredictable thing. And so I think, when we look at a leader's death, a lot of times it either speaks to that leader's ability to kind of control things and get what they want, despite the odds, or their failure to do that. And as I say, I think in general, a lingering kind of death is seen as humiliating and so forth. But I don't think Cyrus's death in Xenophon is meant to be lingering at all. I think it's just meant to be all in due course.
Mm-hmm. On Cyrus, I have another comment, and this is not a question, I think. One of the accomplishments that Cyrus cites is that in old age, he was as strong as he was in his youth. I guess that's a request for a comment.
Yeah.
On this aspect.
So that's a bit heroic as well, right? The idea that at the moment of your death, you could be everything that you were when you were young.
Mm-hmm. On the ritualized aspect of scripting your own death, it seems to me that some of that must come from the fact that these deaths are highly ritualized after the fact. That, not only are they followed by rituals, as we see in this account by Suetonius,
right?
But in terms of hero cult, at least, these deaths are reenacted, on a seasonally recurring basis. There are funeral games, so to speak, every year for Patroclus, for Achilles, and for all these people. So I think it's natural in that sense that the death itself would also be seen as scripted.
Yeah. No, and Suetonius' account of the spontaneous grief that people seem to have felt. It feels very ritualized to me, in the sense that a lot of rituals are about catharsis and even kind of irrational or excessive displays of emotion that are meant to cleanse the community and the individual. And even foreigners are going about mourning for Caesar. And so, I mean, so it really kind of, I mean, it paves the way for the divine cult of future emperors, right? That Caesar's death transcended Rome, or it transcended Roman identity, it transcended gender, it transcended party lines, as it were, as ritual is supposed to do, at least sometimes.
Well, I wonder if you would talk more about perhaps those 3 words on the blackboard or the marker board behind you.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. I'll do that, but let me do my last thing about Cyrus. So I think there's this mention of Cyrus is at the time of Caesar's death, and Caesar's reaction to Cyrus is what we don't know whether this happened or not, right? I mean, somebody thought it did, or somebody started a rumor. Maybe it did happen, maybe it didn't. But it speaks to, I think, Caesar's attempt to incorporate himself into the conversation about the greatest conquerors who ever lived. In other words, like if any of us, pick the person in your life that is most heroic to you, that you really admire and you think is awesome. And when you're on your deathbed, or when you're in a conversation about death with someone, say, I want the opposite of what my hero had, just as a way, again, of including yourself in the conversation. And so by this point, when Suetonius is writing, he's writing a little bit after Plutarch. By this point, kind of in Mediterranean history, there were 3 acknowledged lovers of empire. This is how Plutarch describes them in the life of Artaxerxes. I think he says erastes. He either says they are an erastes of empire, or they have eros of empire. The first one is Cyrus, the second one is Alexander the Great, and the third one is Julius Caesar. And obviously that corresponds to Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And so what I think, in other words, Caesar is not just responding to a random, interesting death of a good leader. I think he's trying to say, look, I can be even better than Cyrus. You thought Cyrus had this awesome death. He had it all figured out. No, I've got an even better death than he does. And that puts him, that puts Rome on top of Persia and on top of Greece with Alexander. It's not always obvious or not always explicit. There is kind of in the back of people's heads a lot of time this idea, okay, Persia had the first major empire. The Greeks tried to emulate that with Alexander the Great, or Alexander tried to emulate that in a very self-conscious way. Alexander read Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, and he even had a historian on Onesicritus with him on his campaigns, writing his history as a second coming of Cyrus. And this was particularly valuable for making Alexander more palatable to the Persians. In fact, there was even later Persian lore that Alexander was a Persian, amazingly, right? By a trick of birth. And then, after that, Caesar couldn't call himself Caesar the Great, because Pompey had already taken that as Pompeius Magnus. But here, at least in this small way, he has an opportunity to put himself into that kind of trifecta of 3 great imperial leaders, beginning with Cyrus. So I think that's a lot of what's going on with this comment. Like he's just trying to introduce the greatest leader into the conversation and say, I'm a little bit better than him. I want a better death than what he had. Does that make sense? Do people buy that theory? I think that explains a lot of why why somebody would have told this story about Caesar, because it's already in Plutarch, that Cyrus, Alexander, and Caesar were. They had this extraordinary. It was like an unquenchable appetite. You could not talk them out of pursuing empire.
I was thinking about Caesar's death as being paralleled by Philip of Macedon's death, that inspired the proverb, in war the loser cries and the victor dies.
Yeah. No, that's a good parallel too. Whether Caesar, because of course Caesar will appoint his heir Augustus, who tries to be like an Alexander figure without all of the personal charisma. We could do a really good spreadsheet about comparing these different leaders, and of course Caesar is more successful in terms of his heirs and in terms of his dynasty than Cyrus was, because Cyrus famously appoints his son Cambyses, and Cambyses is a terrible leader by most accounts in his wake, and many people, I mean, even Xenophon marks the decline of Persian culture or the Persian Empire with the death of Cyrus, which is totally anachronistic because the empire carried on for another 200 years after him. But for Xenophon, that was the beginning of the end of an empire that had only lasted for about 40 years prior anyway. Yeah. So, well, did you? Yeah. Somebody, Maria, were you?
I would like also to add. You also mentioned this difference in the death of Cyrus in Herodotus, and probably because I'm currently reading, book 1 of Herodotus, and I can't help relating the fate of Croesus and how Croesus didn't die after all, but in a way he was punished as the last member of the Marmanad dynasty. So the difference between as regards the death of Cyrus in Herodotus and in other sources, does it have to do also with the aim of the historian or the historiographer? What kind of how he manipulates the historical sources. So in a way, despite the ritualized aspect of death, there is also the manipulative aspect of the historian, while he uses the different sources in order to write the history, his aspect of history.
Right. So Herodotus has the flexibility of having a certain worldview, and shall we say, at least part of that worldview has to do with the power of the gods and also the fragility of human character. Right, that we can all learn great lessons and we can all be cautious and sensible people, but under certain circumstances, like Patroclus or like Cyrus, we're just going to do something that is contrary to our character, contrary to our behavior, and suffer terribly for it. So Herodotus seems to have that. I mean, call it a tragic worldview. He seems to have that worldview, and it also seems to be the case that there were already plenty of stories about Cyrus that would allow him to present that worldview as though it were historically authentic. Herodotus, I think he says that he knows 3 other versions of the story of Cyrus, or maybe he even says the death of. I can't remember if he says the story of Cyrus or the death of Cyrus. He knows other versions, but he gives us the one he gives us because he thinks that's most plausible. And yeah, go ahead.
I think it is exactly what you used, a very eloquent term. It is exactly this plausibility that in a way governs Herodotus's inquiry enacted inquiry, because at least is what this is how he defines history, as enacted inquiry. Like, I have all these various sources at my display, I have asked many informants, but this is I'm going to present you, and you as audience are going to decide what version you think fits. And he says he uses the term gnome, opinion or worldview or view. Yes, I think it is exactly the term that you used is the most eloquent.
Well, thank you. Do you want me to say a little bit about ideal leadership?
One
With
question
Siren?
that I could ask from another viewer. It has to do with maybe a typology of deaths. Do you notice any characteristics in common among, say, philosophers' deaths and leaders' deaths, political leaders, that would distinguish them? Is there an expectation for philosophers to die in this kind of way, and people like Caesar in another way? Or maybe Caesar is too unique, but...
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think the idea is you want to die. You want, kind of back to Maria's earlier point. You want to die as you lived, and so if you're I would use the word leader, philosophers, and for politicians. They're just leaders in different contexts. But say up, and especially who built their career on military expertise, like going out the way you lived, dying while fighting, having a moment where maybe you're past your prime, but in a second you at least get to stab someone in the arm with your pen before you go out. There is some gratification in that, and of course with philosophers, I think the ideal is to die while practicing philosophy. And basically demonstrate how your philosophy has rendered you so fearless that you're so fearless. Death means nothing for you, or you're already so prepared for death. I'm really only thinking of Socrates and Seneca here, but I'm sure there are other philosophers that I could be thinking of that are either affirm this or don't, but nobody's coming to mind right away of other examples. Can I give you a little? We're quitting at 2, right?
That's right.
All right. So can I give you a little advert for what we've been doing vis-a-vis leadership studies at the Hellenic Center these days, and I can incorporate philanthropia into that conversation.
Wonderful.
So last weekend, so we have a program at the Hellenic Center we call the FEBS Journey, and it's just a 1-day or a 2-day workshop that we do with different groups of college-age students here in DC, or who have come to DC to learn about life and ancient leadership. And we call it the FEBS Journey because an Ephebe in ancient Greece was someone on the cusp of manhood who regularly had to go through 1 or 2 years of compulsory military service, at the end of which they would take an oath to dedicate themselves to the well-being of their city. It's a pretty famous oath that speaks to environmental sustainability, to devotion to one's comrades. Michael Dukakis actually, back in 1988, did a paraphrase of the oath when he accepted the Democratic nomination for the presidency, which is a pretty interesting footnote in history. So anyway, we've been doing this in a number of permutations lately. And last weekend, we had a conversation on the meaning of philanthropy, which is one of the words I have up here, philanthropia. For Xenophon, this is one of his core leadership traits. And part of the workshop, it was for this organization called the Fund for American Studies, and it brings students from all over the country to do a semester in Washington, D.C. on basically the American presidency and other aspects of American government. And students do internships at different congressional offices and things like that. But anyway, we talked with them about philanthropia. And I don't know if any of you have studied this concept very much, but it's a much richer and nuanced concept than you might think of today. If you think of someone as being a philanthropist or something, I'm not hating on philanthropists here, but our kind of stereotypical somebody, you know, who's a millionaire and is writing checks to build schools or churches or gymnasia or whatever, trying to make some kind of institutional change in their community. And it had that resonance in the ancient world, but the basic meaning of the word, and you'll love this, those of you who have studied Homer, the basic meaning of the word is humanity. A philanthropos is someone who treats all of humanity as a philos, and that's not really meant to be in kind of an abstract, sentimental way, like you're a lover of humanity or something. It should literally mean, and there are instances where it does mean this. So in the Iliad, for example, even though the term philanthropia isn't there, you see a term, someone who is philos anthropoisi, someone who is a friend to humans. It means you treat them with the same, you treat all of humanity with the same rules of hospitality that you treat your philoi or your xenoi. The people that you have a guest friendship, you actually apply that to all of humanity. So to all humans, so you host them at your home, you give them gifts, things like this, and it speaks to a very kind of warm, personal relationship, whereas modern philanthropy, we tend to think of as a very distancing kind of thing. It's someone, removed in a fancier part of town or living in a higher social circle, trickling down their resources to everyone else. But and Cyrus, to come back to Cyrus, Cyrus exhibits this in all sorts of amazing ways. Yes, he's the kind of leader who will regularly dispense lavish gifts, but he's also the kind of person who will host you to dinner and he will serve you the same food that he serves himself. Even though he's a king and has this vast empire, you'll eat the same food at Cyrus's table that Cyrus eats. Cyrus will show sympathy for your sufferings, and he'll grieve with you, or he'll celebrate your achievements. Just that kind of really personal kind of connection, which I think repays study. If we want to enliven our own notion of philanthropy today, it's worth thinking about how much the concept has changed.
That's great.
So anyway, come see us sometime. We're doing amazing things, trying to get out the ideas of ancient leadership in ways that can renew and help us reimagine our own notions of leadership.
Can I ask quickly, do the Ephebes journeys produce any content that we could view, like videos or?
I mean, we have the old videos of Ephebes journeys, but you probably don't want to sit through 8 hours of workshops and stuff. Have you shared or have you seen the material we did for the leadership course?
I think so.
Well, let me share that with you. And I'll be happy to come back and talk more about these things anytime. Here is an entire site that we created using a platform called Scalar, with a whole range of different modules for exploring ancient leadership. One of the modules is on Cyrus, and it actually ties into questions of what does it mean to be a global leader in the ancient world and today. So take a look at that, and if you ever want me to talk about any of that material, I'd be happy to. But there's hundreds of hours.
We can share that link with the viewers on the Cosmos Society. We'll put it onto the same post where we've publicised this session, so that people who are watching can see that link. I've just grabbed it, so we'll share that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all for joining, and Norman, especially thanks to you for this wonderful discussion and sharing your knowledge with us.
My pleasure. Anytime. And it's great to see you all. Thank you.
And we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.